Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another Video of History by podcast. Today I'm live with Professor Paul Anderson. He is an expert on the Gospel of John, and today we're discussing his book titled The Fourth Gospel and the Quest for Jesus. If you want to purchase this book, the link is in the description below. It's the History Valley Amazon affiliate link to the book. You can get it there. With that being said, welcome to History Valley podcast, Professor Anderson.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Could you tell us a bit about what the Gospel of John tells us about the historical Jesus compared to the Synoptics?
Yeah, well, John is very different. And so, of course, that raises questions about why it's different. On one hand, you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who present a pretty clear view of Jesus, pretty coherent view of Jesus. And yet John is really different. And so that raises a question of why. Another fact is that John is highly theological. It begins with a Christ hymn in the first 18 verses. And so that raises questions about whether John is theological instead of historical. On the other hand, the Gospel of John is the only gospel that claims firsthand derivation or eyewitness testimony that is attributed to at least some of its presentation of Jesus. So these are the kinds of issues that have caused scholars to play it conservative. If you want to go for the historical Jesus, it's best to go with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is a more risky option. So therefore, the first three quests for Jesus have been more reductionistic, more maybe parsimonious, or to use Casamon's imagery, or the second quest, the new quest for Jesus, are there sure stepping stones if we don't want to make mistakes? So therefore, scholars have decided to leave John out. And yet John has a lot of stuff that seems like it's also historical. And so that raises questions about, how to include John in the quest for Jesus, which might, call for a fourth quest.
When it comes to source criticism and information in the Gospel of John, not found in the Synoptics, like additional information about the trial narrative, for example, it's got Jesus and Pilate saying stuff to each other, a lot more stuff to each other than the Gospels would have them say. So could John have gotten that? Did John get that from another source that provided that information to him that the Synoptics did not intake?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a larger question about why John is different. According to Rudolf Bultmann, and to some degree a modification of that by Bob Fortna, maybe we have different sources that have been used by the writer of John. We'll call him the evangelist or the fourth evangelist or simply the narrator. Well, the problem with that view is that evidence for sources just isn't there. In my book on John's Christology, my Glasgow thesis, some of this research I did in Tübingen with Otto Betz, I evaluated all of Bultmann's evidence for alien sources underlying John 6. That's the feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle that's in all four Gospels, and then the sea crossing debate, and then Peter's confession. In my looking at the material that Bultmann attributes to four different sources, a miracle source, a saying source, the evangelist work, and then the editor's additions, there just really is no evidence. My methodology was to take all of his evidence for underlying sources and to apply it out within John 6. And when the distribution came back, it was simply random. I mean, you might have verbs in the action narrative. You might have abstract nouns in the discourse material. That doesn't mean that one's Jewish and the other is Greek. So there's just no evidence for sources underlying John's signs material, for instance. Well, Bultmann thought there might be evidence for, or thought there must be obviously a passion narrative or passion source. That's what Bob Fortna put together with the signs and the passion narrative. So he called it a signs gospel instead of a signs source and a passion source. Likewise, there's just no evidence for that either. It's an assumption scholars have made, assuming that John does not have an independent memory, eyewitness memory of Jesus and his ministry. So, given the fact that there's just no evidence for alien sources, I think you really have to look at John's story of Jesus. Yes, it's developed theologically, but it also has some historical content that the other gospels don't have. I think also that the Christum at the beginning is not the first stroke of the evangelist's quill. Rather, it might even be added by the final editor, who kind of, adds a community's confession about Jesus that actually originated from hearing evangelists preach and teach, over several decades to begin with. So if you look at the original beginning of the Gospel of John, maybe it was chapter 1 verses 6 through 8 and 15 going on into 19. So what if the narrative actually began? And of course, I mean part of this is my argument as to how John was composed. Maybe the original beginning was there came a man from God, his name was John, not the light, witness to the light. He was before him, though he came after him in terms of precedence and that kind of thing. And then people come to John the Baptist from Jerusalem and say, are you the Messiah? Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? And he says, no, because Jesus is. Now, that's a case that I might actually think that the Gospel of Mark, that presents John the Baptist as fulfilling the typologies of Elijah and to some degree Moses. I think Mark might be more historical there. There's a case where I might see John's narrative in verse 19 and following as more theological. Why is John not Elijah? Because Jesus is. He feeds the multitude with barley loaves, like Elisha did in 2 Kings. And likewise, he fulfills the prophet like Moses typology. And so Jesus, in John's theology, really does fulfill the typologies of Moses and Elijah. Now, I think also you have some historical basis for those issues as well. So that when Jesus is accused in Jerusalem for breaking the Sabbath by healing people, he says, well, I'm just doing what God has told me to do. And so you have an appeal to Deuteronomy 18, the prophet like Moses. And so I do think that the prophet like Moses really does cohere with maybe Jesus's self-understanding from day one, that he's operating on God's instruction. His word comes true. Therefore, you know that he really is sent from God.
Does John's passion narrative in any way, shape, or form contradict the synoptics?
I think John's passion narrative is pretty complimentary. Yeah, you've got an extended debate with Pilate. I think you have an ironic presentation of Pilate. He says, don't you know that I have the authority to set you free or to put you to death? And Jesus said, you would have no power unless it were given to you by God. Well, then Pilate is presented as the impotent potentate. He begs the crowd to let Jesus go, and they refuse. And so really he is a slave to the crowd. So I think those are more, Johannine nuance and the presentation of irony there. Well, then again, let me mention a couple ways where I think John might be more historically accurate, or maybe even pushing back as a corrective to Mark in terms of chronology. When we have the Last Supper in John, kind of beginning in chapter 13, this is the day before the Passover. So it is not a Passover meal like it is presented in Mark 14. Then again, in Mark 15, Jesus is not crucified on the Passover. And so I think that Mark is showing him as crucified the day before the Passover or the day before the Sabbath. If Sabbath and Passover are on the same day that year, then Mark is also disagreeing with Mark's earlier presentation in ways that cohere with John. So you might therefore make a guess that Mark's presentation of the Last Supper as a Passover meal, where Jesus institutes a meal of remembrance, well, that might be more Markan theology, whereas John's presentation doesn't have that. It's more sacramental innocence, which might suggest a more primitive view. So I would say that the Last Supper on the day before the Passover is probably more historically correct. Whether John is correcting Mark or not, I think the critical appraisal on that sides with John against Mark, because Mark is more influenced by by church practice and theology than maybe actual history. Just one more. You also have the presentation of the timing of the crucifixion. In Mark, it's the third hour, or 9 o'clock in the morning. Well, um, you've got a lot to happen before 9 o'clock in the morning. So that's a critical problem with Mark's chronology. John, on the other hand, says the crucifixion is at the sixth hour. And so that would be, Friday noon. Well, that seems more realistic in terms of when the crucifixion might happen. So those might be a couple of ways that John, I think, might be a corrective to Mark's chronology if we have familiarity with at least some of Mark's story as a part of the reason for the way that John presents his narrative.
So how does one go about telling if John is correcting Mark in the sense that he is creating a correction? So if he's correcting Mark, then how does one tell from the correction being historically accurate to a correction that perhaps John could have made up? Because some say that John is, as you were pointing out earlier, some say that John is unreliable, shouldn't trust it's the fourth gospel. So how does one tell if John is, when John's correcting Mark, and when John's both correcting Mark and is historically correct?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you have to look at each issue in particular. Let me again articulate a fallacy. A fallacy is to say that because John begins with the Christ hymn, that it's total theology and not historical. That's just plain wrong. Mark is theological also. Also, I'm arguing, along with John A.T. Robinson, Werner Kelber, several other scholars, that the prologue is added later. It reflects the community's response to the evangelist. It's not writing from the clouds from day one. I think the original. Okay, so this leads to guesses about at least a couple of editions. If the later material is added after the evangelist's death, John 21, 20 to 24, Jesus never said he wouldn't die. He said to Peter, "What does it do if he lives till I come again?" Here we have an editor saying, "I didn't write this, he did." Now, does write mean dictated or is penning? Who knows? But somebody is saying, he wrote these things, I didn't. He's an eyewitness. He's dead. Jesus never said he wouldn't die. And so that's a statement about more than one edition. And if you take the Bible just at face value, then that's a multiple level, a multiple layer of John's composition that is finalized by somebody who is not the original author. I might guess, and many other scholars do also, that that's John the Elder, who's author of the epistles. So a theory of composition. Here I'm going with Barnabas Linders. John Ashton agreed with me on this, and several others. Urban von Walde also has 3 editions. It could be a dozen editions, but at least earlier and later material. So the first edition, I might guess, is familiar with Mark, but probably not Luke or Matthew. And so this might be 80 or 85. I'll go with 85 because Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." That seems to be an anti-Domitian corrective. So if Domitian, emperor from 81 to 96, required people to say Lord and God, in Latin, filius et Deus. So if Domitian is requiring people to use that trope to emphasize his divinity and authority, you might see Thomas's confession in John 20:28 being an anti-Domitian confession. So I'll push the first edition, into 85, into the Domitian era, at least a little bit overlapping. Well, that being the case, if the later material includes chapter 21, and so the first edition concludes with, "These things are they might believe that Jesus the Christ, Son of God, believing have life in his name." It seems like a first ending. I think it also acknowledges Mark. There are many others, eyewitnesses, who have told their stories, not written in this book, Okay, as in Mark's out there. I know that. Stop bugging me for leaving it out. This is something different. These things are written you might believe. I'm glad that you have Mark available. So I don't think the evangelist has a written text of Mark in front of him. Maybe he's heard Mark performed among the churches. That was the view of Ian McKay, whose doctoral thesis in Australia I was an external evaluator for. That actually changed my mind. I was thinking that John was more independent of Mark, maybe general familiar, but if we have some awareness, maybe hearing it performed, then the first edition of John, if it doesn't include the Christ hymn at the beginning, the last chapter, chapter 21, what if it doesn't include John 6? And so John 5 and 7, healing the lame man in Jerusalem, that is carried over into John 7. What if we have John 6 added right there between those two chapters? And then maybe John 15, 16, and 17. So 14, 31, let us depart. They don't get to the garden until 18:1. Well, that being the case, the first edition of John only has 5 miracles. And these are the 5 miracles that are not in Mark. So, miracle number 1, miracle number 2. This is before Mark 1. Thank you very much. And then you have an interest in presenting Jesus ministering alongside John the Baptist. So, John 3:24. These things happened before John was thrown into prison, contra Mark 1:14. After John was thrown into prison, Jesus came baptizing. Well, if we have some general familiarity and John's own story to tell, whoever the author is, and I'm happy to use the word John to talk to reference, the Johannine tradition here, whether it's John the Apostle or somebody else. We have an emphasis that here is early material before Mark 1. Therefore, the first sign, the second sign, these are signs that are done before Mark 1. So that implies a chronological augmentation of Mark. Here's some early stuff in addition to what you have there in Mark. The other 3 signs are in Judea, in Jerusalem, and in Bethany. So Mark doesn't have any miracles there in Jerusalem. So maybe we have an interest in augmenting Mark geographically as well as chronologically. And here we have a little detail in Matthew 21:14, where Matthew actually affirms or corroborates the miracles in Judea. Matthew says the miracles that Jesus had done in Jerusalem on the blind people and the lame people. So apparently, Matthew is familiar with the miracles that are only represented in John. So I think instead of saying, well, John depended on the Synoptics, well, the Synoptics are aware of John also, and you have to acknowledge that that's a fact. And so what do you do? What do you do with those kinds of facts? Now, let me just bring in one more point about chronology. If we have an interest in filling out the early chronology of Jesus and his ministry alongside John the Baptist, how about an early temple incident as being chronologically on purpose? Now, here I'm disagreeing with dozens of Johannine scholars. John is theological, yes. Early temple incident. Therefore, John put it early for theological reasons, and John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God," and here he's cleansing the temple, and oh, isn't that great? It's a sacrificial reference. Well, hold on. What if it's chronological? What if we have Jesus alongside John the Baptist doing something as a prophetic demonstration? Just like John the Baptist is challenging Sadducees and Pharisees and Herod and Roman soldiers, what do we have Jesus doing something disruptive alongside John the Baptist in his prophetic inaugural ministry? Well, that would explain why you have in John 4 at the end, you have a reference to the signs that they had seen Jesus do in Jerusalem. And likewise in John 5, they want to kill him already because this is not his first trip to Jerusalem. He's already done this temple provocative thing. So, yeah, so that's one way that John's chronology is different from Mark. And so the question is whether that's, a narrative theological interest or whether it implies theological or his chronological opinion. Just one more here. You also have three Passovers in the Gospel of John. And so it's not just one. So if we have a 3-year ministry or a 2-year ministry with three Passovers, then John's chronology might be more superior to Mark's. In other words, to and from Jerusalem instead of just one visit. So those might be ways that I think John, in being different from Mark chronologically, might actually imply an augmentation of Mark and maybe pushing back a little bit in terms of chronology.
When you mention that John the Elder contributed to the composition of the Gospel of John, does this, does this have to does this have to do with the A2 edition of Johannine composition theory? And if so, can you tell us a bit more about that theory?
Yeah, and scholars have many, many different views about John's composition. My view is kind of just a basic, earlier stuff and some later stuff. So it seems like, again, the Christ hymn is a confession that's a lot like 1 John 1 1 to 3. Well, we've seen it here from the beginning, we proclaimed you the word of life, that kind of thing. So it seems like maybe the author of the epistles, John the Elder, maybe he's even, the one who is using this, or maybe even composed it as a response to the evangelist preaching. So that seems to be added. Again, chapter 21 seems to follow as an addition to John 20, a statement of purpose. This is written, you might believe, and then kind of a second ending. Look, if we've included everything, I'm pushing back, you wouldn't have enough libraries, let alone enough books. And so John's second ending also defends the selectivity of John's gospel being different from the synoptics. Now, also, if the editor, I'll call him a compiler. I think John the Elder is just compiling the evangelist preachings. Here's some other stuff. Oh, how about this? What if the elder or the compiler is also a scribe? What if he's been taking down notes on the beloved disciples preaching, over several decades? So, different views of authorial composition, could go in different directions, along these lines. So if he has added John 6, the feeding, the sea crossing, the debate, Peter's confession, as well as disciples abandoning Jesus, there in verse 66, it seems like that is harmonizing John with the synoptics. So here I do agree with Rudolf Bultmann that the final editor is harmonizing with the synoptics and adding John 6, maybe rectifying Peter. Peter denies Jesus around a charcoal fire, and then Peter affirms Jesus around a charcoal fire. And so, yeah, you have that kind of filling things out. Also, chapters 15, 16, and 17, a bit redundant with chapter 14. Well, it's just continued preaching. And so maybe he's trying to preserve the evangelist's ministry along those lines.
How many composition? Let me rephrase that. How many compositional stages do you think there were in total?
Whoops, lost my computer there. Um, again, Urban von Walde thinks there are 3 editions. I kind of agree with his first and second. I'm not sure that, or with his first, sorry, I agree with his first and second being one, and then the later material being added. It's really impossible to know how many. I'm just happy to go with some earlier stuff and some later stuff. I think there also must have been kind of a process of transforming oral tradition preaching into a draft of a narrative. Uh, that that might involve several editions. What I don't think is that you have a miracle and then a separate set of sayings. I think that the discourses and the signs probably were woven together from day one. And so you might have units of composition. So you have like several beginnings in the first part of John. So you have a Christ hymn, then you have reference to John the Baptist, and then the calling narrative. It's kind of an informal calling narrative where people leave John the Baptist and follow Jesus. And then you have the first sign, and then you have the second sign. So the beginning has several beginnings. You also have several endings. Then you have an ending of Jesus' public ministry at the end of chapter 12. You have an ending after chapter 11. He goes off to Ephraim. You have an ending after chapter 10, where he goes out and hangs out with the place where John the Baptist was doing his original ministry. And so there, the public ministry of Jesus has beginnings and endings. Then in the book of glory, or the last days of Jesus, 13 to 20, you have the beginning of the Last Supper, and then the beginning of the discourses, and then going out to the garden, and then the trial and arrest, and then endings like the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, and then Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb, and the beloved disciple and Peter coming to the tomb, and calling the 12, or calling the apostles, extending the apostolic commission to many people, and then the confession of Thomas, and then the statement of purpose. So you've got beginnings and endings of the later material and beginnings and endings of the early material. So I think that reflects some kind of organizing work by the narrator, and maybe receiving some help by a final compiler. I think that's about as good as we can do.
Can you tell us a bit about the question of John's gospel in relation to Luke and what Luke meant about utilizing orderly or putting together accounts in order, and how that might be connected to the Gospel of John?
Yes, and this is part of my overall theory. I call it a bioptic hypothesis. The synoptic gospels are Matthew and Luke using Mark, but John and Mark, I think, have two different sets of perspective from day one. When you look at all four gospels, you have all four gospels saying the disciples disagreed with each other. They debated with each other about what Jesus was doing and what he meant. Well, maybe you have some of that represented in John and Mark. If Mark goes back to the preaching of someone like Peter, and John Mark is not an eyewitness, he's a follower of Paul, and he's trying to cobble together Peter's preaching. Okay, now fact, or at least guess, Mark probably hasn't heard all of Peter's preaching, so he's going to leave some stuff out. Another likelihood, Peter might not have preached everything that he knew. Okay, and so Mark is gathering stuff, trying to preserve it. And maybe Mark puts it in a conjectural order. And so the Gospel of Mark is not a known chronology, it's a general chronology, beginning, middle, and end. It works pretty well. But maybe John's story of Jesus, maybe it does reflect firsthand knowledge or memory of Jesus and his ministry. Now, of course, it's going to be influenced by theological understanding, but that doesn't mean it's not historical. Here's another fact. The Gospel of John has more mundane material and more archaeologically attested details than all the other Gospels combined, canonical and non-canonical. It's not my fault. Look at it. You have the Pool of Siloam. You have 5 porches around the Pool of Bethzatha. You have Bethany, the distance from Jerusalem. You have 25 or 30 stadia out there in the middle of the lake. You have the lithostroton, the stone pavement, where Pilate is sitting on his judgment bench. But then it's called in Aramaic, Gabbatha, the ridge of the house. Like Mark, you have Golgotha, which also is the place of the skull. But in both John and Mark, you have Hebrew or Aramaic words maybe going back to the ministry of Jesus, that are translated into Greek. So I'm happy to see John and Mark as two independent memories of Jesus. Matthew and Luke build upon Mark, John builds around Mark. So John is different on purpose, augmenting Mark, maybe even, setting it straight dialectically here and there. So your question on Luke. Here's an interesting fact that scholars haven't dealt with well, I think. Given that Luke uses Mark, and everybody believes that, so did Matthew even more so. But given that Luke uses Mark, you have to ask the question, why does Luke depart from Mark in Johannine directions? Let me give you some examples. Luke adds a great catch of fish. That's only in John, although Luke's ordering is to put it as a part of the calling narrative in chapter 5, not at the end of the story. So if Luke has access to John's material, maybe he's hearing it. I don't think he has a Johannine text. Here's another one. Mary and Martha, two sisters who are serving Jesus in ways similar to John chapter 12. How about a dead man, Lazarus? Well, Luke adds a parable, although you have, Lazarus being raised from the dead in the Gospel of John. How about little details like the right ear is cut off? Well, that detail is in the Gospel of John. Or Satan entered Judas. That's also in the Gospel of John. Or the tomb is one that had never been used before. That's only in the Gospel of John. So you have little details that Luke adds, as well as units of material that are only found in John. On the transfiguration, they beheld his glory. Well, does that suggest Johannine familiarity? How about changing a head anointing to a foot anointing? In Matthew and Mark, the woman anoints the head of Jesus. Luke moves it to a foot anointing. Why does Luke do that? It's only in John, other than Luke. So I think the critical judgment on that is you have to ask, why does Luke make these changes? Answer: you have the Gospel of John that he has access to. Here's another interesting fact. Luke brings in then in the next few verses, after the woman is anointing Jesus's feet. Now, of course, Luke then makes a guess, I think, and guesses that she's much sinful, therefore much forgiven, therefore much grateful. So Luke adds a gratitude parable from whatever source he has in mind. But notice that right after that, in chapter 8, he brings in Mary Magdalene. Maybe Luke has heard the name Mary, sister of Lazarus, as a part of the anointing of the feet of Jesus, and thinks it's Mary Magdalene. Again, all you can do is guess on that, but it might suggest the oral character of Luke's familiarity with John, which would explain why he goes in Johannine directions, although he doesn't always follow Johannine order. Let me mention just one more thing or two. Luke has only one feeding, not two. Luke has only one sea crossing, not two. Mark and Matthew have two feedings, two sea crossings. So why does Luke leave out the extra feeding and the extra sea crossing? Here's another fact. Luke moves Peter's confession to the other feeding, departing from Mark and agreeing with John, siding with John. It coheres with John, but does that suggest critically that Luke prefers John's presentation over Mark's? And even Matthew's, does he have access to Matthew? And so Luke moves Peter's confession to the feeding of the 5,000, not the feeding of the 4,000 as it is in Mark and in Matthew. That's a fact. Why does Luke do that? I think the most plausible critical explanation is that Luke has access to John's tradition, John's story of Jesus, and he's trying to harmonize John and Mark. Further, on Peter's confession, in Mark, you are the Christ. John, Holy One of God. Well, Luke, I think, is dovetailing those. He's harmonizing those. Christ of God. He's harmonizing the confession of Peter in Mark and John. So that gets your earlier question about Luke 1:2. what I've received from eyewitnesses and servants of the word, servants of the Logos. Thank you, Johannine tradition, for your help. And maybe John's material, maybe access to John's material, reflects Luke's interest in setting an orderly account where he agrees with John in Luke's corrections of Mark. Now, I'm raising that as a question. I think it's too amorphous to make a claim, but I'm raising that as a question, which I think has a strong critical basis for its plausibility.
Can you discuss the contacts between John and the Q source?
And that's a big question. One question is whether there really was a Q source. If there wasn't a Q source, and here I like Mark Goodacre's putting forward of the Farrer-Goulder hypothesis. If Luke has access to Matthew, then we don't need a Q source. Luke is just using Matthew. Now, I had a good conversation with my friend Richard Bauckham a few years ago in Cambridge, and he's pushing it the other way. He's saying, well, what if Matthew has access to Luke? What do you think of that? Well, I think I might go more with the Goodacre and Goulder and Farrer hypothesis that Luke might be, might be having access to Matthew and maybe also John. But here's a fact. You have similarities. Now, scholars might know what the Q source is, or your audience might know. So it's a fact that in about 230 verses, Luke and Matthew agree with each other in ways that are not included in the Gospel of Mark, like the Lord's Prayer, the three temptations in the wilderness, the healing in Capernaum from afar. And so that's material and a number of sayings that are in like the Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark. Now, it could be that it's just an accident, but a lot of these are word for word. And you also have like similarities on the transitions between some of the units. So that's why scholars have guessed that we really do have evidence for some kind of literary connection there. And the question is whether there's like a narrative source that did not overlap with Mark. Then again, what if it overlapped with Mark? See, that's a whole other question, which really good scholars just have trouble really finding the correct answer for. But but here's a fact: none knows the Father but the Son. That's in Matthew 11 and in Luke chapter 10. That really sounds Johannine. It's been called the bolt out of Johannine blue. And there it is right there in Q, if there was a Q, but it's also a Johannine statement in Matthew and Luke. So if Jesus scholars who have said that the Q tradition, if there was one, reflects early understandings of Jesus or early memories of Jesus and his teachings, it doesn't have a passion narrative. It's just teachings and stuff. When you have some overlap with the Gospel of Thomas, which is clearly second century, middle to late second century, and it's Gnostic, it's a Hellenistic expansion, I think, on the Synoptics and also John. But if you have, if you have a sayings source that overlaps with some of John's material, like the Father sending the Son, or like the seed, or like the harvest is ripe, the laborers are few, that kind of thing, and the Lord of the harvest. So if you have some of those similar sayings, then that raises a question about whether John's sayings might be dependent on Q, or whether Q sayings might be dependent on John. I think the strongest critical facts are that we have Johannine sayings that are in Q, and that might suggest that maybe Q has access to John's material, or it could be that they go back independently to Jesus' teachings, Jesus' material. Now, here's here's another issue which I think is interesting: the healing from afar in Luke and Matthew is the centurion's servant. but it's in Capernaum and it's from afar. In John, it's the royal official's son, but it's also in Capernaum from afar. And the result is the same. Everybody believes in Jesus here. Now, actually, I think that John's story of that is more primitive. It's less developed. In the Q tradition, if there was a Q tradition, you have kind of a moral of the lesson. Whoa, that Jesus speaks with authority, says the centurion. He tells, like I tell people what to do and where to get off, and it gets carried forth. Look at the authority of Jesus here. So it seems to me that that's a more embellished and a longer memory of that miracle going back to Jesus, and is therefore less primitive than John's. John's is less developed. And so I think that is a fact that at least has to be acknowledged, that the Johannine healing from afar is less developed than the healing from afar in Matthew and Luke. Now, here's another fact that's interesting. Notice that Matthew puts that in chapter 8 of Matthew before the miracles that Jesus does in Capernaum, which in Mark are the first miracles of Jesus. So if John is saying this was the second miracle before the miracles in Mark 1, thank you very much, Matthew agrees with that chronology. Whether it's knowing or not, Matthew coheres with John's chronology there. And so maybe Matthew also is agreeing with John. Now, let me just make one more point. Matthew also agrees with John over a dozen times in ways that are not in Mark. And so you have a reference to, let's see if I can remember some of these, but a variety of small details where Matthew coheres with John, like put away the sword. That's in Matthew and John. Well, why does Matthew add that to Mark? Does Matthew know of John's rendering, even though Matthew is finalized later? You also have some references to Scripture, fulfilling Zechariah in John and John and Matthew. So either they're using similar scriptures or they're familiar one with the other, but you have to acknowledge that Matthew is departing from Mark in Johannine directions. So I think that we can't just say Johannine dependence on Mark and the Synoptics. I think things are a lot more fluid, and maybe we have Mark. Let me mention Mark's familiarity with John. So you have in Mark 14 and in Mark 15, you have two citations of John 2:19, where Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, I'll raise it up in 3 days." And so at the trial of Jesus, you have people saying, "Oh, wait, you said you would destroy this temple and raise it up in 3 days." And then on the cross, deriders say, "Hey, you who said you'd raise the temple up in 3 days, come down from the cross." Now, they're also in Mark 15, you have people understanding that to mean Jesus, about tearing down the temple and being raised up in 3 days. So you not only have a citation twice in Mark of what Jesus said only in the Gospel of John chapter 2, but you also have a Christological understanding of the meaning. Come down from the cross, you who said this back then in John 2. So these are facts which suggest critically, if you're going to go with the evidence, that Mark is familiar. Mark presents actors in the narrative who cite the Gospel of John. So even though I think John is finalized around 100, you have John's presentation of Jesus being cited in all three Gospels in the Synoptics, and maybe even Q if there was a Q. It's not my fault. Look it up yourself. So I think these are just facts that complexify or problematize our simplistic solutions of, oh yeah, John is different in theological, therefore John has no independent tradition of its own, therefore John is a theological expansion upon Mark and the Synoptics. Sorry, the facts disagree with that. It's not my fault.
So how would you put it? Are they using, or is each of the synoptics using a different version of John, or they're using some kind of proto John or an oral tradition of John? What's going on there?
Well, I think we have, I think that's why we need a theory of gospel interfluentiality. I really like Streeter's synoptic hypothesis that Matthew and Luke probably used written Mark. Yes, and maybe that there was a Q tradition. So, I mean, am I looking at the triple tradition or the double tradition, not including the Gospel of Mark between Matthew and Luke? Um, I go in both directions. If we have Q, here's what we come up with. If we have Luke using Matthew, here's what we come up with. Just one more point on the Q tradition. The Q tradition does not, the Q hypothesis does not deal with the fact that when you have triple tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, several dozen times you have Matthew and Luke adding a word or a phrase. And a Q hypothesis doesn't deal adequately with those facts unless you have overlap between Q and Mark. Okay. So those minor agreements between Luke and Matthew, where Mark is in the picture, I think call for the Farrer-Goulder hypothesis. And I think that's one of the strongest bases for Goodacre pushing things in that direction. I do disagree with Mark Goodacre, though, a good friend of mine, because he follows B.H. Streeter in guessing that John is theological. It's a mystic composition. It is pulling things out of the blue, and there's nothing historical in John. It's all a theological flourish. And that's because B.H. Streeter has made a terrible error. He has sided with also Benjamin Bacon of Yale, who that was like Streeter is 1924, Bacon is 1909. They're both citing with an article 1888 by Carl de Boer on the early death of the Apostle John. The article by de Boer that again gets built on by Edward Schwartz and others on the early death of John becomes one reason for people guessing that John is not rooted in an eyewitness memory of Jesus. Now, another possibility is that maybe it's a different eyewitness. How about Lazarus? Jesus loved Lazarus. Oh, Lazarus is the beloved disciple. Jesus loved Lazarus. John 11:5. Or how about this? Jesus loved Mary. Jesus loved Martha. Oh, 2-1. He must have been a woman. Okay, so it could be that that maybe you have Mary or Martha being the beloved disciple. Although Jesus says, "Behold your son," at the cross, and then in the appearance on the sea, Peter is naked in the boat. It's hard to believe the beloved disciple is a woman if Peter has no clothes on, and so those are real problems, not just imaginary ones, with the beloved disciple being a woman. Although I like the idea, but there are huge problems with that, and I don't think it's the case. What you have, though, and so, in other words, people might guess or argue, oh, how about this? John the Elder, if he's the author of the epistles, or First John, says what we have seen and touched with our hands is seen with our eyes. Maybe he was an eyewitness. Okay, maybe the beloved disciple is an eyewitness who wasn't a member of the 12. And maybe that's why we have a juxtaposition of the beloved disciple and Peter maybe pushing against the apostolic 12. Well, the problem is that the final editor says, I'm not the evangelist. He's the evangelist and he's dead, or Jesus never said he wouldn't die. So that's a huge problem with John the Elder being the final editor, who says, I'm not the evangelist. And so I think we still have to go for someone like John the Apostle, or I mean, name whoever else, but I don't think there's any better critical guess than John the Apostle. Nobody else is hanging out with Peter in the Synoptics. like John the Apostle is. Nobody else in the 2nd century is associated with a beloved disciple other than John the Apostle. John the theologian is not a reference to John the elder. Look it up. It's a reference to John the Apostle, or the beloved disciple. So there are huge problems with that, but one problem is not that John the Apostle died early. So de Boer argued that James and John died. They suffered martyrdom. James died in 44 AD, or Common Era, CE. Therefore, they must have died at the same time, and that's what's described. James's death is described in Jerusalem, there in Acts chapter 12. Well, if John died early, he cannot have written what is attributed to him later. So that's a good point. But the two sources that de Boer is citing, who are claimed to reference Papias, whose writings we do not have, these two sources are from the 5th century and the 9th century. One is Philip Sidetes, Philip of Sides, or Sides, there in southern western Turkey. Now, and the other is George Hamartolos, George the Sinner. And so that is, he's writing in the 9th century. So de Boer argued that these two sources cite Papias, who claims or references that James and John suffered martyrdom, and therefore, if James died early, John died early, therefore he could not have written anything attributed to him. Therefore, it must have been John the Elder, the confusion of Johns and all that stuff. Well, when you actually look at what they say, they don't say they died at the same time. They say they suffered martyrdom. Origen says John the Apostle suffered martyrdom in exile. That was his martyrdom, fulfilling Matthew 20 or Mark 10. Are you going to drink my cup, be baptized in my baptism? We are, therefore you shall be. So you do have the prediction of Jesus that they will suffer martyrdom. But they don't claim they suffered martyrdom at the same time. They don't say John died early. They both claim further that John the Apostle died in Ephesus after Domitian, following Eusebius. So Domitian died in 96. And so both Philip and George claim that John the Apostle died in Ephesus around the turn of the 1st century. And so to say that John the Apostle could not have written the Gospel of John because he died early is an embarrassment to critical scholarship. And my good friends who have built on that just haven't looked up George and Philip. Look it up. Now that doesn't prove that John wrote things or that it had anything to do with the Johannine tradition, but the 2nd century tradition memory is unanimous on that. Okay. Now you do have some problems with John the Apostle being the beloved disciple. And of course, his memory gets embellished all over the place. And so I love Alan Culpepper's book on that, and James Charlesworth's book on the beloved disciple. You know, and Charlesworth thinks that maybe it's Thomas, and yet Thomas had not yet believed at the end of chapter 20, but in the first part of chapter 20, Thomas had believed. So that's a problem with Thomas being the beloved disciple. Although, you know, I mean, I love that idea, but that's a real problem with Thomas being the beloved disciple. What you have, though, is some real problems with authorship. Why is it that John the Apostle is never mentioned by name? The sons of Zebedee are, or those of Zebedee in chapter 21, verse 2. Well, they're there in the picture, although they're not cited. Also, you have a third person reference. The beloved disciple, he did these things. And so whoever is writing this is not writing about himself. So you do have somebody finalizing the story of the beloved disciple, as opposed to him writing stuff about, you know, the first person singular. Here's what I did. You do have first person plural references. We believe his testimony is true. Or you have a third person reference to the eyewitness. He saw water and blood coming out of Jesus' side. We believe his testimony is true. So there you have, you know, some kind of writer maybe the final editor, acknowledging the eyewitness claim of someone, if not the evangelist, maybe the evangelist. So you do have problems with John's authorship, but to say that it therefore cannot be John the Apostle or somebody like that because it disagrees with Peter, or because John died early. No, John did not die early. At least nobody thought that until 1888. And so that really is an embarrassment to critical scholarship. So those are just some of the issues that are a part of the difficult question about authorship and composition. I'm happy, of course, it doesn't really matter who the author was. And here I do agree with Alan Culpepper. We have literary text, it's in the canon, it's authoritative. Whoever wrote it, it must be interpreted on its own ground, as opposed to making guesses about interpretation based upon who the author was, and I would say also based upon who the author wasn't.
And in my closing question, would that suggest to you that John, John's source material that is connected with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, does that to some degree require looking at Q in a different way? Like, okay, so Q has a double tradition material in Matthew and Luke, but it has even more material than that. And then my final part to that question, how does that help us in general reconstruct the historical Jesus?
Yeah. So a larger question. I think we have to use all sources that are plausible. So I'm calling for a fourth quest for Jesus. The first three quests have been parsimonious. Let's leave John out to make sure we don't make any mistakes. But I think we need new criteria for determining historicity. Instead of multiple attestation, kick out anything that's not in all four or all three gospels. Well, what if Luke and Matthew, or Q, what if they have some independent material that goes back to Jesus or John? So I think we have to look at, instead of multiple attestation, a more generous liberal approach is, how about corroborative impression? So you have in Mark and John, you have the way of the cross, but it's in different language. If you deny me before men, I'll deny you from fathers in heaven. In John, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Be willing to suffer and die with Jesus. It's not saying take the Eucharist or you have no salvation. It's saying, look, the flesh that I give for you on the cross, eat that, take that in, and be willing to suffer and die with me. So you have the way of the cross described in Mark and John in different ways. So instead of just quotations, well, let's look at meanings and content in ways that corroborate. Instead of naturalism versus supernaturalism, well, what if Jesus really was a miracle worker? Here I will go with the Synoptics and say, I really do think Jesus was an exorcist, and that he cast out demons and that he healed lepers, even though those things are not in John. But what if Jesus also healed people, like Marcus Borg talks about, as a holy man, as a person who had gifted spiritual capacities? So I think we have to not just kick out everything that seems wondrous. We have to say, okay, well, what kind of a healer was Jesus, and take that seriously. So there we'll go with critical realism instead of dogmatic naturalism. Just as dogmatic supernaturalism is problematic, dogmatic naturalism is going to skew things in ways that cut stuff off unnecessarily. How about instead of dissimilarity with later material, if it's like what happened later, therefore you can't trust it. Well, what if they got it right? So instead of you can only include as historical stuff that seems weird and not Jewish and not Christian. Well, that's going to leave you a pretty small portrait. How about material that seems to be primitive or similar to, like, Jesus of Nazareth, even if it's not developed later on? So there, I think we can go with Son of Man material, or an eschatological agent, or Jesus fulfilling Moses and Elijah as typologies that aren't really developed like the Christological hymns. Prophet like Moses happens in Acts 3:22 on Peter's confession. also in the testimony of Stephen, and it's also in the Gospel of John, and it's also in Matthew. And so Jesus, it's also in Mark chapter 12, being the agent being sent from the Father to the vineyard, and they kill the Son, as well as, rejecting the Father's initiatives. So I do think Mosaic agency is a way to talk about the Father-Son relationship. We're not talking ontology here or metaphysics. We're talking agency. And in that sense, John helps us appreciate maybe the sense of his mission of Jesus of Nazareth, not just later theological developments. And then a fourth one would be corroborative, kind of cohering or coherence with what we understand Jesus to have been like. And so it's a general portraiture instead of a particular portraiture. So those are ways I think we can include sayings material in Q. Oh, yeah. And if Q has wisdom material, we got wisdom material in John. Here I'll throw in Bart Ehrman's work on Jesus as an eschatological prophet. Yeah, I think we have some of that in John also. So yeah, I think that a fourth quest for Jesus is required if you want to do adequate historiography. The first three quests have been conservative and reductionistic. That's all fine and good. I'm happy to go with what they think is likely historical plausibly. On the other hand, they cut a whole lot of stuff off that is also more impressionistic. So I think that a liberal, inclusive quest for Jesus, if they're going to include Thomas and Nag Hammadi stuff, how can they not include the Gospel of John? Then again, when you're using the Gospel of John, you have to acknowledge that Thomas is dependent on John instead of John depending on Thomas. And so I think that a theory of gospel complexity and interfluentiality is essential, finding a way of including John in the quest for the historical Jesus. And in chapter 4 of the book that you mentioned, what I do there is to say, here are 8 ways that John agrees with the synoptics and ways that are corroborative. And then I go with 8 ways where I think the synoptics are superior to John. I really think Jesus spoke in parables. I really think Jesus was an exorcist. I really think Jesus, did some things that he healed lepers. That material in the synoptics, teachings on the kingdom, I'll go with the synoptics on that material. On the other hand, I'll go with stuff in John that I think is superior to the synoptics historically. An early temple incident, to and from Jerusalem, ministering alongside John the Baptist, doing some signs in Jerusalem, not just in Galilee. So those are some ways leading through the Holy Spirit. I think that Jesus in Q and also in John talks about sending the Spirit that will guide people into truth. So there you have another corroboration of Luke and Q and John in terms of Jesus, talking about a relationship with God through the Holy Spirit. That probably goes back to the historical Jesus, not just, later developments in the early church. My next book coming out is Jesus in Johannine Perspective, a fourth quest for Jesus. And I've just edited a huge book on archaeology, John and Jesus, with 24 top archaeologists around the world. And that'll be published by Erdman's next year. I think that'll be a game changer.
Yeah, when it does come out, let's do a show on it. That sounds exciting.
That sounds good.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Anderson.
Hey, thank you, Jacob. Great being in touch. All the best.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.